Hello there, I'm Grandmaster Johan Hellstend and I'm very pleased to welcome you to my video series, Every Pawn Structure Explained. In this course, you will get a comprehensive overview of the most common patterns, giving you the tools that you need to understand pawn structure in your games, and also let you know the common plans and tactics in each type of position. In today's lesson, we will have a look at the isolated queen's pawn structure. So what is this structure about? Let's have a look. Here we have the pawn on d4. This is the pawn which gives the name to this structure. Because it's isolated, as you can see, there are no pawns on the neighbor files. There is no pawn on c2 or c3, which could protect the pawn. And that means that in the long run, white has a weakness. The pawn on d4 is weak in the long run, and black would like to attack it, let's say, later on in an endgame. But also we can see that the isolated queen's pawn has several good things about it. One of them is that we have a good square here on e5, and this square could be used, for example, by a white knight. So if we have a knight on f3, for example, the knight would just love to go to e5. It's a great place for that knight. Another thing that we could take into consideration here is that white has more space. And this means that we can, for example, try to bring a queen to the d3 square, and we can put the bishop on c2. And this would be ideal in order to start an attack at the black king. So basically, when you have the isolated queen's pawn, one of your key plans is to attack black's king. While another important idea for white to take into account here is the d5 push. White would very much like to play d5 at some moment. He would like to open up the position by means of d5. So this idea is also important to take into account. What about black's plans then? Well, one key plan for black is to swap pieces and get closer to an endgame, where this weakness of the isolated queen's pawn would be more notable. And another thing which black should take into account is the possibility to block that pawn, to block the d4 pawn. And that could be done, for example, if we have a knight on f6, the knight would very much like to settle on d5. This is an excellent square for the black knight, a blockade, so to speak. Okay, now we should also take into account one thing about the pawn structure. Sometimes we come across the isolated queen's pawn in a different version. Sometimes the pawn on e6 is on c6. But it's rather similar kind of structure. The same ideas apply here. One difference is, however, that the diagonal a2 g8 is open. And this means that if white is able to put the bishop on this diagonal, it will usually become rather strong. Another idea here, but for black, would be to use the open e-file. So sometimes if black has a rook on e8, it will be easy for black to swap pieces, let's say, along the e-file. All right, at this point, let's have a look at a dream position for white. Here we have white's dream position, so to speak, in the isolated queen's pawn structure. You can see that all white's pieces are participating in the attack against the black king. There are several white pieces which are very well placed here. We could single out, for example, the knight on e5. This is a very strong piece. As you can see, the knight is protected by the isolated queen's pawn and it's attacking all these pawns on the black king side. While another important piece here is the rook on g3. As you can see, this rook has traveled from f1 to e1 to e3 to g3. This is a typical rook lift, which is very useful in this structure. Sometimes we can go to g3 and sometimes we can even move on to h3 in order to attack the black king along the h-file. While another piece that we should notice here is the h-pawn. As you can see, white had played earlier on h4, h5, and this is a very useful plan in order to soften up the black kingside defenses. So basically, all white's pieces are very well placed here, and he has very good chances for a successful attack. Now, let's have a look at black's dream scenario. Here we have black's dream scenario in the isolated queen's pawn structure. As you can see, several pieces have already been swapped, which is good news for black because now his king is feeling a lot safer. And on the other hand, as you can see, the pawn on d4, the isolated queen's pawn, cannot really advance. It has been blocked. There is no chance that white will be able to achieve d5 in the near future. So what would black play here? Most probably, since he already has the isolated queen's pawn under control, he would now like to start an attack at this pawn. So a good move for black here would be knight e7. In this way, the knight could get closer to either c6 or f5. I think it was actually Aron Ninčović who explain this idea. First, you should block the isolated queen's pawn, and then you should attack it and finally destroy it. So that's an excellent plan if we're that lucky in practical games to get to this situation. Let's see what could happen here. Let's say white plays rook f1, defending the pawn. We could play here rook d5. This is a good square even for the rook. Black is now preparing to double the rooks along the d-file and to put pressure at the isolated queen's pawn. Let's see what happens if white continues to defend his pawn. Let's say white plays here rook d3. We could continue to bring the other rook to the attack, and after rook d1, knight c6, queen d2. As you can see, 4 pieces are attacking the isolated queen's pawn, and 4 pieces are defending it. This means that we cannot take it right now, but here we have a very important tactical trick at our disposal. We can play here e5. Please remember this trick. As you can see, we're now exploiting the pin along the d-file. White cannot take on e5, obviously, because then he's losing a lot of material. So for this reason, probably, if we go back a few moves, I guess white will have to play rook d2 instead. But still, as you can see, black would have a very pleasant position here, attacking the pawn on d4. On the other hand, I would also like you to show one little detail here. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's see what happened here. We played knight e7, and white played rook fd1. Let's say we only move the rook until d6 instead of going to d5. And let's see if there is any difference here. Again, we're attacking the d-pawn by all possible means. However, here there is a big difference. It turns out that actually white has a tactical trick here. He can play d5. And this is a very important idea which we should always take into account in these structures. d5 is very strong here because after e takes d5, actually white can take on d5. And as you can see, black cannot take twice. In that case, he would be mated. Summing up, this is a very important situation to understand. Black has reached his dream position. He can now put pressure on the isolated queen's pawn. The best way to do it, knight e7 followed by rook d5. And then simply bring all the pieces to attack the pawn. And don't forget this nice tactical trick, e5. Let me tell you that one of the reasons why it's so important to understand the isolated queen's pawn structure is that it can appear in so many different openings. Here I will just give you a few examples. One of the clearest examples is the queen's gambit accepted. If black takes on c4, we can very often end up in an isolated queen's pawn structure. Let's say white plays here e3, black can play e5, and as you can see, after bishop takes c4, e takes c4, e takes c4, we're actually there. We're already in the isolated queen's pawn structure. And actually the very same position can be reached in the French exchange variation. If we play something like this, as you can see, we can reach basically the same kind of position, c4, pawn takes, and bishop takes e4. So no matter if you play e4 or you play d4 with white, you have a reason to understand this structure. And another opening where we can very often come across the isolated queen's pawn structure is the Tarrasch defense, which starts like this: c4, e6, knight f3, or knight c3, c5. Here actually both players can end up with the isolated queen's pawn, but typically it's black who will have the IQP here. After knight c6, it's very interesting to notice that probably white's best move here is d3. This is the way which usually white counters black's Tarrasch defense. And the reason is that once we develop the pieces, let's say like this, d takes e5, bishop takes e5, as you can see, here is the isolated queen's pawn. And the interesting thing here is that white has used a kingside fianchetto. And this is a very good idea, usually, when we're facing the isolated queen's pawn. Because let's say, for example, black would play later on queen d6, bishop b6, and bishop c7. As you can see, white has his king rather well protected, thanks to these pawns. So that's a good thing to take into account. Very often, when we face an isolated queen's pawn, it's interesting to opt for a kingside fianchetto. Anyway, let's have a look at a game where we can see some of white's main ideas in this structure. White played here e4, and after black's c6, white hurried to take the game into the Panov attack. E takes d5, c takes d5, and c4. This is a very safe way, you could say, in which you can reach the isolated queen's pawn structure if you're facing the Caro-Kann with the white pieces. So after knight f6, knight c3, black played e6. Please notice that if black would play here g6, trying to arrange the kingside fianchetto, well, usually white plays here queen b3. And it's easy to understand this. White simply doesn't want to reach a typical IQP structure. he is immediately putting pressure on the pawn on d5. Anyway, let's see what happened here in the game. After e6, white played knight f3, knight c6, pawn takes, and here of course black could have taken with the pawn also. This would be a different game. As you can see, white is tempo up, perhaps by playing bishop e5, some ideas with knight e5. White might be slightly better. Anyway, black played knight 65, and in this way, as you can see, we now have the